In the stillness of the night, a dimly lit room bore witness to a man wrestling with the weight of his past decisions. His name was Nauman, a 35-year-old with a face that carried the scars of time, struggle, and silence. Once a bright-eyed boy filled with boundless dreams, he now sat on the edge of despair, wondering how his life had drifted so far from what he had once imagined. Nauman had always believed he was destined for greatness. In school, he was one of the sharpest minds in his class, often praised by teachers and admired by classmates. He believed that success was inevitable for someone like him. But reality had its own script. In his final year of high school, where everyone expected him to outshine the rest, he failed. Not by much, just a single mark short. But that one number shattered his world. The whispers around him turned into laughter. The admiration transformed into pity. And his confidence, once so firm, began to dissolve. That failure wasn't just academic, it was emotional. It was his first lesson that life doesn't always reward talent. Sometimes timing and luck play bigger roles than ability. Though devastated, Nauman didn't give up. He reappeared in the exams, cleared them, and moved on to college. But the spark was dimmer now. His enthusiasm had weakened. He no longer aimed for the stars, just passing was enough. College became a series of unmemorable days, and his grades remained mediocre. After graduation, he began his job hunt, hoping to redeem himself. But rejection followed rejection. He walked the streets with his resume, moving from office to office, hope slowly fading with each closed door. Eventually, he landed a job in a small private firm. The salary was low, the hours long, and the recognition non-existent. Yet he worked with quiet determination because deep down he believed his time would come. But fate wasn't done testing him. 2 years later, the company shut down, leaving him jobless once again. Rent piled up. His mother's medication became a daily worry. Bills arrived like enemies, silent but merciless. Left with no other choice, Nauman began driving a taxi. People from his past looked at him with disbelief. "So this is where education took you?" some said. Others pitied him, thinking he had wasted his potential. But Nauman didn't care. He replied to no one. Inside him burned a silent fire. He believed no work was small. Every day behind the wheel was another lesson. He would observe his passengers, listen to their stories, and draw strength from their struggles. Each ride taught him something new, about life, about people, about perseverance. One day, an elderly man entered his cab. He had a gentle demeanor and kind eyes. As they drove, the man struck up a conversation. When Nauman shared parts of his journey, the old man listened intently. After a long pause, he said, "You have something rare in you. The ability to keep moving despite the weight of failure. That makes you stronger than most." The old man turned out to be a renowned motivational speaker. Impressed by Nauman's resilience, he invited him to join his team, not for a job, but to grow, to learn, and to eventually inspire others. Nauman began working with him, starting as a simple assistant. But within months, his commitment and clarity began to shine. He became a team leader, then a presenter, and finally a speaker in his own right. The boy who once failed in front of a classroom now stood before auditoriums filled with hundreds. He told his story, the story of failing again and again but never quitting. He looked into the eyes of his listeners and said, "If I had succeeded early on, I wouldn't have become who I am today. My failures shaped me. My broken moments built me." He didn't rise despite his failures. He rose because of them. Nauman's life had taken a turn he had never anticipated. Standing on stages, speaking to hundreds of people, and sharing his failures as a badge of honor. It was surreal. But what most people didn't know was that even this phase came with its own set of battles. His first few speeches were far from perfect. He would stutter, forget his lines, and sometimes even freeze mid-sentence. After one such event, Naumann sat alone, backstage, drenched in sweat, questioning himself. Am I even meant for this? Maybe I'm trying to live someone else's dream. The old man who had first recognized his spark sat beside him and said, Naumann, failure isn't always a fall. Sometimes it's a push. You're not falling, you're being pushed toward the person you're meant to become. Those words hit him harder than any applause could. He realized that the fear of failing again was the very thing holding him back from truly succeeding. So he decided to stop aiming for perfection. Instead, he started focusing on honesty. He began speaking from the heart, sharing not just his struggles but the emotions that came with them. He spoke about loneliness, pressure, and the feeling of watching your dreams slip away, one rejection at a time. His words no longer sounded rehearsed. They sounded real, and that reality started touching people. A woman in her 40s once approached him after a seminar with tears in her eyes. I've been rejected from every job since my divorce, she said. I thought I was a failure. But hearing your story reminded me that maybe I'm just preparing for something bigger. Naumann hugged her gently and replied, You're not alone. None of us are. We're all walking through our own storms as his reputation grew. So did expectations, more events, more cities, more pressure. There were times he would miss meals, lose sleep, and spend hours on the road just to speak for 20 minutes. People admired his strength, but no one saw the anxiety attacks that struck him before big events, the self-doubt that whispered to him at 3 a.m., or the memories of his first failure that still visited him like an old wound. But every time he stood up to speak, he remembered that version of himself, broken, jobless, and driving a taxi with nothing but silent dreams. That memory reminded him of how far he had come. One day he was invited to speak at his old university, the same place where he had once felt like a disappointment. The same campus that had echoed with gossip about his failure. As he walked through the familiar halls, emotions swelled in his chest. When he stepped on that stage, the auditorium was filled with young faces, some full of hope, others drowning in confusion. He took a deep breath and began, This was the place where I first thought my life was over. Today it's the place where I'm telling you that your life hasn't even begun yet. The applause from the university stage still echoed in Naumann's ears as he sat in the car on the way home. It wasn't pride he felt, it was peace. For the first time in his life, he no longer viewed himself as someone who had failed. Instead, he saw himself as someone who had endured. But life, in its unpredictable way, had another test prepared for him. Just when everything seemed to be aligning, when invitations flowed in and recognition began to settle, Naumann's mother fell seriously ill. The hospital visits became frequent, and so did the bills. He cut down on speaking events, choosing instead to stay by her side. Watching the woman who once wiped his tears now lie helpless in a hospital bed was a pain beyond words. During those sleepless nights in the hospital corridor, Naumann began to question everything again. Was this what all that struggle was for? He thought. Why does life keep pulling me back down every time I try to rise? As days passed, his savings dwindled. The phone stopped ringing. Emails slowed. The world moved on as it always does, unaware of the private storms people fight behind closed doors. Some even began to say, Naumann, oh, he was good for a while, but he disappeared. But Naumann didn't care. He had stopped living for applause a long time ago. He now lived for purpose. One evening as he sat beside his mother, she held his hand weakly and whispered, I know life has been hard for you, but I've seen you stand every time the world tried to break you. That's success, my son, not fame, not money, but your ability to stay kind, to stay strong, and to keep going. Those words lit a flame inside Naumann that had nearly gone out. He began journaling again. In those pages, he poured his pain, his hopes, his thoughts on failure, strength, and growth. What started as self-reflection slowly took shape as a book, a memoir not about victory but about the value of being broken and built again. He titled it, Falling Forward. He didn't write it to impress, he wrote it to heal. And that honesty made the book resonate deeply with people. Within months of publication, it went viral, not because of flashy marketing, but because people saw themselves in his words. Messages flooded in. Your book gave me hope after I lost my job. I thought I was a failure until I read your story. I was going to give up, but you reminded me to keep going. Naumann, once dismissed as a failed student, a forgotten speaker, a mere taxi driver, was now inspiring thousands not just from a stage, but from the silent comfort of written words. But fame still didn't change him. He still lived in a modest apartment. He still visited the same tea shop he used to sit in during his jobless days. He still looked at people with the same humility, never forgetting the feeling of being unseen, unheard. One day, a young man approached him at the tea shop and asked, "Sir, I've failed in my business 3 times. Everyone says I should quit. What should I do?" Naumann looked him in the eyes and said, "Let them count your failures. You focus on counting your lessons. The world only sees success when it shines, but you learn to see the value in what the world ignores." That moment wasn't recorded. It wasn't posted online. But for that one boy, it became a turning point. And for Naumann, it was just another reminder that success isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. His voice didn't shake this time. His heart didn't race. He spoke with the calmness of a man who had befriended his failures, who no longer feared falling, because he had learned to rise. As the crowd gave him a standing ovation, Naumann didn't feel victorious. He felt grateful. Grateful for the failures that shaped him, for the pain that matured him, and for the road that broke him, just enough to rebuild him stronger. Time moved forward, as it always does. Naumann's book continued to reach people he had never met. Students struggling with grades, entrepreneurs rebuilding after bankruptcy, single mothers juggling survival, and even retired professionals searching for purpose again. He had become a silent companion in the lives of thousands, not because he offered solutions, but because he offered honesty. And honesty was rare, but while the outside world saw him as a man who had made it, inside, Naumann knew the truth. He was still evolving. One rainy evening, Naumann was invited to speak at a corporate leadership summit. The stage was dazzling, the crowd dressed in expensive suits and expectations sky high. He looked at the polished faces, the confident eyes, and realized these were not people who wanted motivational fluff, they needed realness. So he walked up and said, "I'm not here to tell you how to lead, I'm here to tell you how to lose." The room fell silent. He continued, "Because everyone talks about winning, how to be the best, how to rise, how to lead, but no one teaches you how to fail with dignity, how to walk through shame, rejection, and loneliness and still stand." That night, he didn't just give a speech. He opened a wound that the audience had kept bandaged behind their titles and trophies. And by the end, many eyes in the room were moist, not from inspiration, but from relief. Relief that someone had finally acknowledged their silent battles. Later that night, as he was about to leave the venue, a CEO followed him outside. "You know," he said, "I've built companies, made millions, but I've never had the courage to speak the way you just did. I wish I had your clarity." Nauman smiled and replied, "Clarity doesn't come from winning. It comes from being broken enough to see clearly." With every such encounter, Nauman began to realize a deep truth. Success isn't about achieving more, it's about becoming more human, more aware, more honest. His journey had turned into a map for others, a reminder that failure was not a detour, it was the main road. The only road that taught endurance, humility, and depth. He was soon approached by several global platforms, even universities abroad, but instead of saying yes immediately, he paused. There was something else he needed to do first, return to the streets where his journey began, not to be celebrated, not for nostalgia, but to remember. He took a flight back to the small town where he once drove a taxi. He walked its dusty lanes, stopped outside the school he once failed in, and visited the tea stall owner who had once let him drink without paying. "You still owe me 5 cups, the old man joked. Nauman laughed and said, "And those 5 cups carried me through more than you know." He quietly donated a library to that school. He set up a scholarship fund for students who had failed at least once. Because he believed those were the kids who needed encouragement the most. He didn't put his name on the plaque. He didn't call the media. He just smiled, stood in silence, and let the moment live. As he watched the children run through the schoolyard, one of them tripped and fell. The child looked around, unsure whether to cry or get up. Nauman whispered under his breath, "Get up, little one. You're already on your way." Nauman's return to his roots wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual. As he left the town that had once held his silence and scars, he felt lighter, freer. But freedom wasn't ease. With recognition and influence came responsibility, and Nauman was no longer just telling his story. He had become a voice for many who had none. He began mentoring young people, those who were lost, overlooked, or labeled failures by society. He met with college dropouts, rejected artists, failed athletes, and broken dreamers. He never lectured them. He listened. And when he spoke, his words didn't feel like advice. They felt like truth carved out of survival. One day, a 24-year-old boy came to him. His startup had crashed. His family had disowned him, and he had nowhere to go. Nauman took him in for tea and said, "Tell me everything, but don't skip the parts that hurt." The boy hesitated, then poured out his shame, his mistakes, his regrets. When he finished, Nauman quietly replied to him, "You're not broken. You're just becoming." That young man would later write his own book, dedicating the first page to "the man who taught me how to fail properly." But while Nauman was busy healing others, he had forgotten to check on himself. He worked non-stop, traveled constantly, and gave more than he had. His body began to slow down. He ignored the signs. Until one day, on a flight back from a speaking tour, he collapsed. Doctors said it was physical exhaustion paired with severe emotional fatigue. "You've been running on empty," one of them said. "Even engines break when they aren't refueled." That hospital room reminded Nauman of a younger version of himself, broken again. But this time, he didn't feel defeated. He felt aware. For the first time in years, he paused. He didn't write. He didn't speak. He just rested. He allowed himself to be still, to be quiet, to heal. Because even warriors need rest, even healers must be held, even the strongest among us are still human. During those weeks of silence, Nauman reflected deeply. He thought about his journey, not just the external successes, but the internal transformations. He realized that every phase of his life, no matter how painful, had taught him something irreplaceable. His school failure had taught him humility. Joblessness had taught him hunger. Driving a taxi had taught him dignity. Losing his mother had taught him grief. Rebuilding himself had taught him purpose. And this breakdown? It was now teaching him balance. When he finally returned to the stage, he didn't speak as a man who had figured everything out. He spoke as a man who was still learning. He looked at the audience and said, "Success didn't change me. Failure did. Because failure stripped away the noise, the ego, the distractions. It introduced me to myself." The crowd listened not to be impressed, but to be understood. Because what Nauman offered wasn't a formula for winning. It was a way to live with depth, courage, and grace even when the world calls you a failure. Years had passed. Nauman was now in his early 50s. His hair had turned salt and pepper. His steps had slowed, and the fire in his eyes had matured into a calm, steady flame. One afternoon, a young girl named Zara came to him. She was just 19, on the verge of dropping out of university after failing 3 semesters in a row. "Everyone says I'm a waste of potential," she said, her eyes wet. "Maybe they're right." Nauman smiled gently and handed her a notebook. "Write me 3 failures that taught you something no book ever could." She stared at the blank page for a while, then slowly began to write. When she looked up again, she was already lighter. That's what Nauman had learned over the decades. People don't always need to be lifted. They sometimes just need permission to fall without shame. In quiet hours, he would sit alone and think about the boy he used to be. The one who had failed his exams, been mocked by friends, lost jobs, slept hungry, and wept in the dark. He would close his eyes and silently thank that version of himself, because without him, this man could never have existed. The broken pieces had become his strength. The world often saw him as someone who had made it, but in Nauman's heart, he never saw himself as a success in the traditional sense. He saw himself as someone who had simply refused to stop. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest kind of success. On his last public appearance, he stood in front of a small crowd and said, "They told me I was a failure, and they were right. I failed again and again, but each failure peeled away a layer of ego, and what remained was something real, someone unafraid to start again." There was no standing ovation that night, no fireworks, just quiet clapping, a few tears, and a deep silence, the kind that lingers when something true has been said. Years later, after Nauman passed away peacefully in his sleep, people didn't remember him for his titles or trophies. They remembered how he made them feel less ashamed of their imperfections, how he taught them that broken was not bad, that broken was a beginning. In a world obsessed with flawless success stories, Nauman had offered something different, something braver. He gave the world a story where falling was not failure, but flight in disguise. The story teaches that true success is not measured by how high you rise, but by how many times you rise after falling. Failure does not define you. How you respond to it does. Those who fall, learn. Those who learn, grow. And those who grow lead, not with pride, but with purpose. The most successful people are not those who never failed, but those who never stopped walking, even when the path disappeared.